Good morning, everybody, and welcome to How to Secure Exchange in an Interconnected World and a Never-Ending Battle Against Evil with Michael van Horenbeeck. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, David. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, depending on where you're joining from. And thanks for being here today. Let me go ahead and start sharing my presentation with you, and then let's dive into the topic that we have at hand today. So this session is about Exchange at large, not just about Exchange as an application, service, a server that you run, but the different aspects of Exchange. And it's a topic that is near to my heart because I've been an MVP for about 10 years, of which the first 6 to 7 years I was mainly an Exchange MVP. So it's been a product that I've been very familiar with, that I've spoken about very often. And then I made the transition a couple of years back to security mainly. But still today, whenever we get engaged with customers that are facing issues or challenges with their cybersecurity, I do notice that Exchange is always, or not always, but a lot of times, an application that they find hard to secure, that is ill-secured, and where a lot of the basics, or at least what I consider the basics, are not covered. And that's what this session is about today, to walk through the different aspects of Exchange and kind of see what you can do to make sure that your deployment of those Exchange servers, however small, however large your environment is, becomes more secure, and that will put you in a much better position. Now, why is this important? Well, all of us, we understand that the challenges that we face today are very different than the challenges that we had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. Exchange has been around for a very, very long time, and as such, it has evolved, it has changed a bit, and it has adapted to the new world that we live in, the new way of working. As such, it's still, Exchange that is running an Exchange Online, or at least, it's a distant relative. But we are facing a never-ending battle against threats and attacks, whether they're directly towards Exchange, like unfortunately we had last year, or through the underlying components that make part of your Exchange server. There are different ways. There are a lot of things that we have to consider in our deployment, because each and every single element within such a deployment, everything that touches Exchange directly or indirectly, can lead to an Exchange server becoming vulnerable, becoming exploitable, or ultimately becoming breached, after which the step up from an Exchange server that is breached or that is compromised to anything else is not much, right? Once an Exchange server has been exploited, then getting to the domain dominance is rather, I wouldn't say simple, but it's something that can happen really quickly, right? Now, with ransomware attack being on the rise, with everything that's going on, with zero-day vulnerabilities almost being, being hit or hitting the news every day, there's a lot of things that we have to consider. And what kind of moved me to suggesting this session is literally the attacks that were happening against Exchange last year. For better or worse, whenever software is written, things happen, right? Bugs are written. Sometimes they were there for a long time, but not discovered. And, it doesn't make Exchange server as a platform a horrible application. Unfortunately, we had in a very short time frame 2 very bad 0 days. And what I learned is that not so much these Exchange servers were the problem, but how they were implemented within the environment. A lot of organizations kind of cut off these servers from the internet in order to reduce the exposure. But what they forgot is that they still had this server within the environment. And let's imagine that you have an Exchange server. Let's do a little throwback into history. So let's say that we were in the midst of the crisis that we were facing with Exchange last year with the proxy vulnerabilities, and you shut off Exchange from the internet. Lots of customers thought, hey, this is fine, I can go back to sleep. But the attackers found another way into your environment. Well, through that other way into your environment, they could now attack from the internal network, that Exchange server, and escalate their privileges that way, and from there move to other services within the environment. And when we take a look at what's on screen right now, then what you will see is how complex these attacks can become, right? And this is just one of many examples of how we typically see attacks unfold, whereby a attacker does things, and initially they start their reconnaissance phase, which could mean a lot of things, right? They can do social engineering. They go on social media and try to find information about employees, and then try and figure out what these employees are doing, how influential they are, whether or not they can be targeted in a phishing attack, what value they could bring. They will more than likely scrub of these employees, oftentimes administrators within an organization, their public repositories of GitHub, websites, blog posts, and then scrub the data that they find there for anything that can be useful, anything that gives away the setup of the environment, potentially even usernames, passwords, certificates, and that can give them a way in. In some cases, today less than before, they will start scanning the public IP addresses and see what's there. Obviously, because everything is scanning everything the entire time, it's easy for an attacker to be unnoticed when they do a port scan, when they do a website scan, in order to figure out, hey, I've got this website, what is it running? Or, hey, I'm hitting an Exchange server, great, that's a potential attack target. And then with that information, whatever they found, they can start and try to gain access within the environment. Now, typically, when we're not talking about a zero-day vulnerability, or not a zero-day vulnerability like what we had with Exchange last year, then it involves phishing. It involves an activity that requires someone else to do something, right? It is very, I'm not going to say that it doesn't happen very often, but it's much more rare that an attacker just needs to launch a script to a web server or send a request to a web server and then immediately get the ability to execute code on that server. Now, we've had a few ones last year, which is much more than the years before, or at least in a much more critical way. But bear with me for a second. So after reconnaissance, they go to the initial access phase, the initial attack phase, where they try and get something running, whether it's the immediate or through someone else, phishing messages and so forth and so on. And the goal of that is to deliver the payload. Now, it's very similar to the proxy attacks, where they send a request, the request actually downloaded the payload was executed on the server. So the principles behind that are actually exactly the same. Now, they can go direct, they can go through one of your own users, or they can leverage a business partner that sends a legitimate email, which is much harder to identify as a phishing email or a phishing message, hoping that ultimately they can get to the exploitation phase, whereby malicious code is ran, and that code is used to compromise the device that it is running on, or parts of the environment in which it is running. Now, oftentimes it is because they're exploiting a vulnerability, which could be because it's not very often, but sometimes a zero-day vulnerability. Sometimes it's a vulnerability that has existed for a while. And then especially when it's a vulnerability that has been around for a while and known for a while, it's because of bad patching, right? That then leads to that server being exploitable. The code runs, can be exploited, and then that leads to a compromised device. And from there, lots of things can happen, right? The device is compromised. If they really want to generate impact right away, then they will start executing on intent, which means they can launch ransomware, they can do data or extract data from that one server, and try and impact you that way. That's often the case when it's some sort of collateral damage or some sort of drive-by attack, where you're not really the ultimate target that they're after. But let's say that you're a large commercial enterprise, you are a government, then chances are that they don't want that one server. They'd like to have access to the entire server. Maybe they don't even want to launch ransomware, right? Because that creates impact, that lets everyone know that you've been breached. But ultimately, what they're trying to do is to stay within the environment, to stay undetected, and then potentially get to your sensitive data, snoop around. It's spying, if you will, right? Now, how that works, again, there's a million and one ways, and what you can see on screen is in one of them, is that the compromised device, through that initial device, they try and move laterally across the environment. That may happen interactively, which they could do when they establish some sort of phone home system, a beacon, which is very it's not popular, but it's very common in targeted attacks where attack groups are, within the environment for a long time. They need to have a way to interact with these compromised systems so that they can have those systems do different things. So once the beacon's set up, then, they're going to do another discovery, but instead of external discovery, internal discovery, assuming they don't already know what path they're going to take. And then, that leads to alternative attack paths, which ultimately leads to moving from one device to another, exploiting multiple misconfigurations, multiple vulnerabilities. So to move from one system to another, which allows them to pick up potentially, higher privileges. So they may enter the environment as a regular user that may have local admin permissions, but by moving laterally, they may be able to get a tier 1 admin or ultimately get to a tier 0 administrator, which then gives them domain dominance. And we're going to talk about that tiered model in just a minute, because that's really, really relevant to how Exchange works. Now, very complex, I would say, but very elaborate story to say that there's a lot of steps involved. Now, why is this important? Well, the more steps that are involved with a typical attack, the more opportunities you have to, detect what's happening and to intervene at that point in time. Now, looking at Exchange as such, there's lots of moving parts, right? We've got that one block called Exchange server that has a multitude of a multitude of components at that. But under Exchange, there is the core operating system, Windows, upon which it runs. Exchange is installed in an Active Directory. As such, there is an Active Directory that we have to take care of. And then there is the general architectural bits and pieces, the network, how it's published, basically the topology of Exchange. Now, without any of these breaks, then that Exchange server might fall off. So we need elements to secure each of these components in their own proper way, so that helps increase the security posture of the Exchange server and lower the attack surface, thus making it more robust against threats and attacks. For an operating system that is typically hardening the OS, patching the OS on a regular basis, so we're not just talking about Exchange server, but also the operating system, it means having an antivirus and EDR solution. And I know that's a controversial topic for Exchange, but it's still very much needed. Then we've got our core security on Active Directory, the topology of Active Directory, how you do administration within the network within AD. As such, the deployment model of Exchange in AD, which is the permissions models that we're going to talk about. There's how you do network segmentation, how you publish Exchange. And then there is, on the application layer, how you configure Exchange, how you harden Exchange itself, keeping Exchange up to date, how you're dealing with security operations and monitoring of that Exchange server or that health of that environment. And then, obviously, within the application, so I would say layer 7, how securely is Exchange communicating with other servers around the world, is interacting with them, how is it keeping data secure, and so forth and so on. So when we take a look at this high level picture, you can immediately identify that there's much more than just clicking next, finish, making sure the server works, and then off you go, right? There's lots of things to consider. Now, the way I like to approach a lot of the engagements that we have from a security perspective, whether it is Exchange or anything besides that, it is leveraging a framework. Now, I'm not married to one or the other framework, but I like the simplicity of the NIST CSF, or the cybersecurity framework, right? Because it identifies 5 different activities, phases, if you will, on where you can spend time and effort to increase the security of your environment. It starts with identifying what your weaknesses or your threats are. By taking a step back and looking at your deployment, trying to figure out, what is my attack surface? When you're looking at a single Exchange server, your attack surface, as I mentioned before, is much more than just that application. It is the operating system. It is potentially the hardware that it's running on. It's the data center that it's in. It's the application that it communicates with. It's the Active Directory. It's the administrators. It's the sensitivity of the messages that you're sending through it, and so forth and so on, right? So it's very, very, very important, and really important, that you understand what you're trying to secure, right? And why you're trying to secure it, and in which way that you're going to do that. And once you've figured that out, then you can move to the next phases, right? In which you're going to spend a little bit of time and resources in all of the phases that follow. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to just add all your resources to protecting everything and then just assuming that your server is fine, because it is impossible to secure Exchange or any other application for that matter for 100%, right? So you have to spend, I'm not going to say an equal amount of money, but a respectable amount of money in the other phases as well. So protecting Exchange means, as I said earlier, hardening the OS, hardening Exchange, adding the antivirus, making sure that you have the secure baseline in the configuration, doing some auditing there. But then also, having the ability to detect what's happening. So you need proper logging, you need to monitor the logging, you need to review the logging, you need to monitor what's happening in the environment, which typically means having an AV and an EDR or IPS on the network. You have to know and understand what's coming in and out of the environment, what normal behavior looks like, so that you can detect abnormal behavior on such a server. And that's probably one of the key points that I want to hit today, because during these proxy attacks last year, when we engaged with customers, I was often faced with, well, we don't know, right? I have no clue where to look, no clue what to look for. And to make things even worse, a lot of times there were no logs for us to do any investigations on, right? We're going to talk about the server hardening, but one of the things that really gets to me is that there is probably the majority of the Exchange servers out there that have a security log that resets or that overwrites older entries and maybe only keeps 250 megs. Well, if you're on a busy server and you're being attacked at midnight, for instance, then by the time you get in the morning and you review the logs, a lot of it is already gone. So, increasing those logs, especially in modern days, like disk space is not what is going to be costly. You need to have these security logs available, or you need to ship them elsewhere so that you at least can figure out what happened, right? That you can know whether it's happening. But we're going to get to that in just a minute. Now, after you detect or have the ability to detect what's happening within the environment, well, at least you need to be able to respond. It's great to have these fire detections all over the place, and it can tell you, hey, there's a fire here. But if you can't respond and to kind of put out the fire, then none of these measures really had any effect. So you need to have robust or at least some level of security operations, even if your security operations is let's call someone that can come and help us. Like, this is the number that we need to call, kind of like the Ghostbusters, right? If shit hits the fan, then whom are you going to call? Well, that's the party that we're going to call to help us. That's fine. That's a plan. At least it gives you something, but it doesn't leave you scrambling if you are ever facing a potential attack on Exchange or another application. And then lastly, assuming that everything else failed, right, where you weren't able to protect your environment, you got in, you didn't detect in time, you were too late to respond to the threat, and parts of your data or your servers have been compromised and data has been leaked or data has been ransomwared, then you need to be able to recover your data. So having a proper backup, whether potentially controversial opinion, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, is important, right? You still need to be able to continue your business after such an event happens, because one thing that you don't want to have happen is that your data is gone, your data is unusable anymore, and that you just have to go back to people and tell them, well, I lost my data, can you help me, and so forth and so on. It just doesn't paint a great picture. So given that we have about 15 minutes to cover all of these topics, I have to be very selective about where I want to spend my time with you today. And in terms of patching, I probably could spend 15 minutes explaining why patching is important, how you do patching. But I feel that after 20 plus years of Exchange and many, many years of the new servicing model for Exchange, and also Windows, the underlying components, that you understand how to do patching and why patching is important. I really hope that you're not doing it by hand, like manually updating your Windows servers, and that you're using, the Ring deployment model, that you're using modern tools, whether it's, SCCM or anything else, doesn't really matter, but that you are in control of your updates and that you update fast, right? The times where you could sit back, relax, and wait weeks for a security patch to be deployed on a server or a workstation, those are long gone, right? So I think that is a really important message, and I thought it would be funny to kind of reinforce that message with a small poem for you, but one that you can also hang on the wall, so that IT understands that thou shalt patch, right? To keep foes away, to keep foes out. For peace of mind, if we may, we must patch, no doubt. For a server without updates has vulnerabilities left and right. This every admin hates, so we must patch with all our might. Hear this important message. You should keep your servers secure, for if you want to avoid a wreckage, the latest updates you should ensure. So with that, I mean, we've said everything there is to say about patching, because I don't want to go into a discussion about, hey, we can't because of X, Y, Z. The story is, if you have third-party applications that prevent you from updating your core applications and thus keep you in an insecure state, that is what you need to fix. Now, I understand that legacy, you have to carry it along. You can't break business, but that's where you have to spend a lot of time and resources, because if they prevent you from updating now, they will keep doing so in the future, and that is what will ultimately come back and bite you in a royal behind. So let's switch gears a little bit from the patching story and dive into Exchange and Active Directory, because for better and worse, these two are interconnected like a PB&J sandwich. It means that they're basically one and the same. I'm not going to say it is the one and the same, but they need one another. So much is clear. So before we dive into the how and why these things matter, let's take a look at the underlying idea of why this is so important. And we're going to talk about a tiered administration model. So I'm just going to assume for a second that you've heard about lateral account movement, about escalating privileges, and that everyone here on the call has heard about a tool called Mimikatz, which allows you to extract NTLM hashes from a machine, especially from administrators that may have admin rights somewhere else. In other words, especially smaller organizations that don't have a central IT environment, they may have one admin account, and that one admin account is domain admin and is administrator on a server and is administrator on a workstation, and they use that support admin, if you will, for everything, right? To install updates, to help people with troubleshooting issues on their device. But unbeknownst to them, by using that account on different machines, they're leaving traces behind, and they're leaving those machines potentially, depending on the configuration, vulnerable to the use of Mimikatz, where that NTLM hash can be extracted and then can be reused to gain access to a different server, or at least a server where the account that was logged on locally on that device can be reused. So to avoid that, for a very long time, that there has been this model of segregation where you take a look at the criticality of servers/services within your environment, and then put them in a category being tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, and if you really want to go overboard, you go for a tier 3. But I think a 3-tiered model is more than good enough, right? Where tier 0 is, this cannot be compromised, or nothing should be, but this is like the most critical bits and pieces. Anything that has to do with authentication, anything that is related to AD, Azure AD Connect, ADFS, certificate services, anything that tier is tier 0, and you should have separate admin accounts that are only used for tier 0 accounts. And then we have a tier 1, which contains application services, where you have tier 1 accounts. And then we have tier 2, where you have your workstations or lower tier servers, anything basically that doesn't fit in tier 1 and tier 2. Now, that idea of tiered administration has been around for a long time. This isn't new. And the goal to do so is to keep your environment more secure, and to limit the lateral account movement or the privilege escalation capabilities that an attacker might have if they compromise one of the tiers. Now, obviously, if they compromise tier 0, you're dead in the water anyway. But the idea is that if they compromise a tier 2 workstation, which are on the front line, right, where phishing happens, where they can run their malware, that they don't easily can get to tier 0. I've seen some really interesting results with pen tests that we did with customers, where within 15 minutes, the attackers went from compromising a workstation to domain dominance. Like 15 minutes is not a long time. It's barely enough to figure out there was an alert and what to do with the alert. So when you're in such a situation, this is what could help. Now, obviously, The tiered administration model has its downsides as well. It means a little bit more work for admins, but at the end of the day, it's just the right thing to do. Now, how does that relate to Exchange and Active Directory? Well, let's take a look at Exchange and AD and how they kind of mix and match together. It's two different applications that have this relationship whereby a mailbox is an object within Exchange, but it's directly tied to a user object in AD. They don't exist independently from one another, unless we're talking about very specific scenarios. But a normal mailbox, whether it's a shared mailbox or a room mailbox or a user mailbox, all of these elements, or a distribution group, if you will, have an object in Active Directory. Now, when an administrator in Exchange creates a new mailbox, and they do new mailbox, or they go through the GUI and add a mailbox, there's a two-step process, well, three-step process. First, when all the details are entered, the Exchange Trusted Subsystem, which to keep things easy is the service account that interacts with Active Directory, just creates the object on behalf of the user that just performed the activity, and then afterwards creates the mailbox in Exchange and then adds them together. Adding the object in AD requires the Exchange Trusted Subsystem to have the necessary permissions, but because of how Exchange is installed within the environment in different partitions of AD, where it creates these objects, the Exchange Trusted Subsystem has a lot of permissions by default. Like, it has a lot of permissions. And that is also why Exchange is a beloved target for attackers, because the majority of the organizations that I know are in the shared permissions model, which is the default model when you just install an Exchange. That's what it picks for you. And if you don't choose anything else, that's what you'll go with. And as such, as an Exchange server, one Exchange server has been compromised, it means that the server, or that the attackers have access to the Exchange Trusted Subsystem, which gives them way too much permissions within Active Directory, providing them with an attack path on DAD, which is very large. So the idea is that we want to find a way to limit this ability. And there's two ways that we can do that with Exchange. First of all, there's Horenbeeck split permissions, which is Microsoft's recommended way. And this is great if it's basically using the shared permissions model, but you're adding a very robust Horenbeeck split permissions model on top of that, right? Where unlike granting anyone the ability to create a user and a mailbox at the same time, you're going to create role-based access control, or role groups, I should say, within the Exchange Horenbeeck, where you're going to give specific admins the ability to perform Active Directory activities, and you're going to give specific admins the permissions to perform Exchange activities. And by segregating that, you limit the risk of an administrator that is compromised being able to immediately jump into Active Directory. Now, whether this is great or not, it is a much better way than just using the default shared permissions model. The documentation from Microsoft with regard to the Horenbeeck split permissions actually explains in quite great details what the benefits are. It gives a lot of flexibility. For those that are into Exchange Horenbeeck, you know that this is super configurable, so you can do a lot of things and it's super flexible. However, it doesn't solve the fact, in my opinion, that the Exchange Trusted Subsystem still has a lot of permissions in AD, like overly a lot of permissions. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's always been that way. It's always needed those permissions, right? It needs to be able to read and write in different parts of Active Directory. So it's not a problem per se. It's just a fact that one can lead to the other. And then, so to mitigate that, we have AD split permissions, or the AD split permissions model, whereby if you're not in the split permission model yet, then you have to rerun setup so that the split permission model can be configured for you. But it basically draws a line in between what Exchange does and what AD does. To make things really simple, the permissions that the Exchange Trusted Subsystem has within AD are largely taken away. So it can't write on behalf of Exchange anymore in Active Directory for a lot of the objects, i.e. when I try to create a new mailbox, that'll fail, because the command new mailbox will create a user account, or will try to create a user account and attach a mailbox to that user account. However, as an Exchange admin, I can still run enable mailbox, which leverages a existing Active Directory user object, and then I connect a mailbox to that user object. which is very, very different. So I can do segregation from an administrative perspective. I can make sure that the exchange servers themselves have less permissions with AD, and therefore I can actually move Exchange from a tier 0 application, if you will, into a tier 1 application in some shape, way, or form. So does this mean that everyone needs to move to AD split permissions? God, no. That's not the goal, right? It's just to make sure that you understand the benefits that you're getting from it, because everything has two sides, right? The benefits are you're increasing security. Downsides are, well, certain functionalities that won't work anymore, right? More notably towards distribution group management, because you're severing the ties between Exchange and AD. You're telling them, nope, Exchange, you can't do this anymore. So this is also one of the reasons why the Horenbeeck split permission model is recommended by Microsoft, because you're getting a lot of the values of the AD split permission model without the drawbacks that the AD split permission model provides to you. However, if you're in a highly regulated environment, and where we typically see AD split permissions is in defense environments, in banking environments, in healthcare, where security is really, really number one, and they're heavily regulated, and people want to make sure that they keep that high level of security. So let's move into the operating system, right? As I mentioned during the first bits and pieces exchange, underlying there's the operating system. What do you need to do about that, right? How can you make sure that that doesn't become the bottleneck, or the one component that makes your exchange server less secure, right? Well, looking at Windows, despite all the efforts to making it a very secure operating system, we're still writing code, and as such, there will be bugs, whether we like it or not, and some of them will be severe. So rather than taking a standard Windows and install that on a server and then install Exchange on top of that, it is really important that you do basic OS hardening, right? Now, how to do OS hardening, it depends on how you manage your environment. There's lots of GPOs that you can deploy. You can do SCCM baselines, or lots of things. And also what you should be doing depends on, how much time you have, how knowledgeable you are, and so forth and so on. Now, don't go and reinvent the wheel. Please don't. There are plenty of security baselines out there that provide you a very secure, starting point, whether you're using the CIS benchmarks, which are somewhat the golden standards of making sure that your Windows servers are secure, or you use the Microsoft MSB, the Microsoft security baselines, or you use the Department of Defense STIGs, which provide guidance on how to configure or how to secure the Windows servers and other applications too. If you haven't done so already, take a look at these recommendations. They have step-by-step guides that tell you, okay, now go in, increase the security logs, use this TLS level, disable these protocols, do this, do that, do such, do so. Because by doing so, you enable the secure foundation upon which you're going to add your Exchange server, and you make it much harder for an attacker to exploit that server, because despite the 0 days that we've had last year on Exchange itself, there are way more vulnerabilities in Windows, and by limiting the ability to exploit those vulnerabilities, or the standard binaries and configurations of Windows to gain unauthorized access to the Exchange server, the better it is, obviously. Now, what does that include, right? What are some of the elements that typically need to include? As I mentioned, make sure that auditing is enabled of several activities. Not auditing in Exchange, right? Not talking about the event log level and bumping it up to expert, all the way to expert level. You don't need to do that, right? But making sure that you have auditing of specific Active Directory records and activities on the server itself. That's one element. Make sure that you do proper account management. It's kind of related to the tiered administration model. Just make sure that you treat these servers as sensitive, that not everyone has access to these servers, that the accounts that have access to these servers are not the accounts that you use to log onto workstations. I mean, it's basic hygiene, and I can't believe that I really have to reiterate this, but it's really, really important that you treat those servers as sensitive, and thus keep them in a separate tier, but in a higher tier, right? Then look at the network. If you are in a wide network, then do some host-based firewalling on the machines. If you don't, great. Then make sure that you've got firewalls in their network. If you can at all, then just go for microsegmentation, where every traffic is regulated by a firewall, but just don't put it in the middle of your network with little to no traffic constraints to and from workstations and the rest of the network. Now, I know that this has been a point of discussion because Microsoft's recommendation for Exchange and AD is like 80/20, just open it up, which is fairly okay, considering that if you treat both Exchange and AD as a tier 0, then that should be entirely fine. Obviously, details kind of depend on the environment and on what your network looks like, but having a minimal a form of making sure that the Exchange servers are shielded from the rest of the environment so that you can easily move from one host to another is important. Disable unused OS components. Disable components that or third-party applications that don't need to be in the server. Right now, if you have a default Windows installation, then there shouldn't be much extra. But I'm always surprised that when I do some investigations on an Exchange server, then I see these third-party tools to monitor disk space and to do this and to send emails and to do that. And it always gets to me because these applications are often just downloaded from the internet. They have no updates whatsoever. Yes, they make the life of an administrator much more easier, but then just use them once and take them away from the server. Just don't let them sit there because they could be the potential next application or vulnerability that leads to the compromise of that server. And then also from an application perspective, remove or restrict execution of applications, not just OS components, that are not strictly needed for an Exchange server. In other words, just install an Exchange on that server and keep it as an Exchange server, period. Don't make it a multi-purpose server because you're going to run into lots of other issues. So some examples are admin audit logging. That's an Exchange-specific one. So make sure that that's on so that you can track if changes are happening within Exchange. Do some connection logging. That too is an Exchange-specific element so that you know which traffic is coming in. Because if you're doing some investigations as part of an attack or a breach, then at least you can figure out if something came in through transport, what IP addresses they came in from, because that could be an IOC that you can then use to track other activities from those same IP addresses. PowerShell on Exchange server just require the signed scripts from being executed. Unsigned scripts on an Exchange server, that just gets to me. Yes, I know, Michael, what are you talking about? Because back in the day, I published a script to put an Exchange server in maintenance mode. That script was not signed, and I know lots of organizations have used that script before. Same goes for the virtual directory report script that I once wrote. If I were to do it again, I would definitely sign those scripts. And there is nothing that prevents you to download a script from the internet, verify that script, make sure that it is okay, and then sign it yourself so that you know that it has been signed by you and that version of the script can run on the server. Make sure that RPC client access is encrypted, disable basic authentication and or firms-based authentication where possible. The latter is a very unpopular opinion, right? Because firms-based authentication means that I'm publishing a form onto the internet, which, if there's a vulnerability in a form, allows me to actually exploit that. So I'm on the verge on that one. I mean, I love functionality provided by Exchange. I love the forms-based authentication because it gives them the web interface to users, which they really need, because that regular authentication prompt isn't easy or isn't user friendly, I would say. But it all depends on the situation that you're in, how critical that the infrastructure is, and whether or not you want to actually make such elements internet facing. And then also to improve the security on premises, it's more from an end user interaction perspective, not so much the Exchange server itself. Consider using hybrid modern authentication, which we will not be talking about during this session anymore. There's some other sessions about hybrid security that probably talk a little bit more about this. As this shifts, gives more flexibility on how you secure incoming connections from clients. Now we had OS, we had Exchange components, but there are other components on that operating system that Exchange leverages, and IIS is probably the most well-known one, right? That's also the one that is internet-facing. I think it is a capital sin to leave the IIS untouched and be like, yes, this is great. I'm just going to use the IIS server as is. There are configuration baselines, security baselines for IIS to make it much more secure. Now, you have to be careful in what you do, right? Because it is core to Exchange. Just don't go into IIS and start disabling stuff all over the place or changing settings, because that will, at some point, break Exchange. An example thereof is Windows Extended Protection. It's a feature that has been in Exchange for a while, but is only supported with Exchange, sorry, has been in IIS for a while, but only supported by Exchange since the August 2020 updates, right? So you first have to make sure that Exchange is fully updated before you can go in to enable a Windows Extended Protection in IIS. Now, long story short, the extended protection in IIS protects against man-in-the-middle attacks by adding two components to the connection, right? So there's channel binding, making sure that the connection that you, or verifying the connection that you have, and then the service binding, making sure that, you know, the requests that are coming in are actually for the service that you're, you know, that you've requested access to. So those double verification, I would say, tremendously increases the protection against man-in-the-middle attacks, because it means that, you know, if there is a man in the middle and you come in for, let's say, an auto-discover AWS request, they can't just reuse that request and then go for OAuth or for anything else, right? So it's something to consider, but there are some prerequisites to look into. And I believe that fellow MVP Paul Robichaud had actually written a really good blog about that a couple of days ago, maybe a week ago. So if you haven't already, or if you didn't know about this capability, definitely go and check that out, because I do believe it is it's an interesting thing and something that you should consider in, especially if you're in a highly secure environment. Let's talk about security operations, right? So you don't know what you don't know. I mentioned it a couple of times. Protecting is one thing, but you have to know what's happening within your environment. You have to detect activities. So basically, what this means is make sure you have an AV and ADR installed on the Exchange servers. No, don't go in and scan everything, because there are specific files and services that you have to exclude. If not, you're going to have a performance penalty on the Exchange server, right? So make sure that you follow Microsoft's guidances to make sure that you exclude the files and folders and services that you have to exclude. But please, please, please make sure that you do have an AV. It's a host-based AV. It's a Windows Server AV that monitors the server, and that you have an EDR that monitors activities and that allows you to track malicious activities. If you don't have an EDR, at the very least, enable PowerShell script block logging so that you know which scripts are being executed, because a lot of times when malicious activities are performed on an Exchange server, it is through PowerShell. And at the very least, that gives you the ability to have some artifacts of an attack so that you can puzzle back and then try to create a story. Because once you are in an environment or in an incident, and you are able to track what was done, you also immediately understand how bad the impact is, what you need to do, and how you need to move forward to remediate and to kind of evict the threat from your environment if at all possible, right? So it is to make sure that you're not blind. And then what you should do as well, and this is less from a technical perspective, but is make sure that you have playbooks, that you know what you need to do. You know, what if the Exchange firm is breached? What if this happens? What if they can do this? That you know that for each of these types of scenarios, and you don't have to create 100 ones, right? What if they ransomware the data? What if they corrupt the database? What if they did take over the Exchange server? What if they take over AD? You know, for each of these scenarios, you should at least have some understanding of how you're going to respond, what you're going to do to mitigate and potentially even remediate the threat that is going on within the environment. So increase the Windows security log file size. I mentioned it at the beginning of the session. Monitor the clearing of the security log, because as an attacker, if I know that I'm being monitored, then if I can clear the monitoring log, in this case the security log, it means that I'm erasing my traces, and thus clearing the security log could be indication of malicious activity itself. As such, the clearing thereof should be an event that you should look into. Do not enable long-term Exchange event log levels higher than what is default. Why? Well, if you take the event log levels, you put everything on expert, and then I start spamming the server with lots of activities, you're going to have like a lot of events piling up on the server, and that could have an adverse effect. It's basically some sort of log file based denial of service attack to an Exchange server. I still have to see the first Exchange server that goes down because of this. But since we're talking about everything that you could do, just take a look at these things. Is it horrible to have one of these event log levels set to higher or highest? No, absolutely not, right? So I'm not over dramatizing things. It's just one other element in the sea of things that you should consider for Exchange that you have to include. And as I said earlier, make sure that Exchange script logging is enabled as well. We talked about the AV and EDR, so I'm not going to go into detail there. I personally love Windows AV, so the Defender and the Defender EDR. The only thing that I do want to point out is lots of people think that Windows Defender excludes Exchange by default. It doesn't. It excludes the Windows components that it knows about, so you still need to configure exclusions for Exchange, and know that AV itself is not enough. As I said, monitor activities through an EDR. So for the remainder of the session, I want to focus a little bit more on publishing Exchange. And what do I mean with publishing Exchange? Well, that on-premises Exchange infrastructure needs to talk to the internet so that it becomes somewhat usable for your users, especially because lots of users are now working remote. Well, they have been for many years, especially in Exchange. It's probably one of the first or one of the most important workloads that has been internet facing for quite a long time. So basically, it means clients need to be able to connect to TCP 443, HTTPS to the Exchange server, and the Exchange server needs to communicate with the wider internet, with other MTAs in the world using SMTP. I'm limiting myself to 443 and 25 here. Yes, there's other ports that we should consider. If you want to use POP3 and IMAP, which you quite honestly shouldn't, but then you have to include these as well. But let's just stick with the two most well-known and the most important ones for a typical Exchange deployment. Then what it looks like in a secure way of publishing that is having an Exchange server in the back, that's on the left-hand side, then having a pair of firewalls. This could be one firewall that virtually splits internal and external traffic. But for sake of clarity, I put them on screen like two distinct firewalls that forward in and out traffic as it comes in. So unfiltered traffic from an SMTP server comes in through the firewall, goes to a message hygiene solution, could be on-prem or in the cloud. Let's just leave it at that for now. And then that one sends the filtered messages back through the same firewall or another firewall into the Exchange server. Now that message hygiene component could be the filtering, a filtering agent on the Exchange server. I'd rather pull it away, right, so that it doesn't even touch the Exchange server, have an appliance, have a service, just not having that on the Exchange server itself. I know there's lots of solutions that do that, just a personal preference to have that separate appliance. On its way out, same goes, transport to firewall to message hygiene to the internet, which means another MTA. Clients, on their end, they connect through a firewall, through a reverse proxy, back through a firewall to Exchange. Now, what does that bring to us, that reverse proxy, the ability to limit what the clients have access to, what happens within a session, if we will, especially if we do session offloading or a session decryption, re-encryption to Exchange, which is important. So we can add a component of security on that reverse proxy story. And then traffic from Exchange to the internet, also run it through a forward authenticating proxy or a forward proxy so that we can keep control of that. As I mentioned, a reverse proxy is much more than just a step in the middle, because taking a look at what's running on IIS and Exchange, we've got OI, ECP, PowerShell, EWS, Auto-Discover, and so forth and so on. You may not want to expose everything, right? Now, if you just have an IP address and do port forwarding, then you expose all these ports to the internet. By having a reverse proxy, you can selectively say which virtual directories that you want to publish, like you don't want to publish ECP, but you do want to publish MAPI and Auto-Discover and OWA, but you don't want to publish PowerShell, and that is possible there. Now, which reverse proxy that you use, that's an entirely different story. but it gives a lot of flexibility there. Now, oftentimes load balancers, which you need for Exchange anyway, they will include that reverse proxy functionality, so you don't really have to split them off, but it is important that you have it. Now, on top of that, right, a reverse proxy can have web application firewall capabilities that allow you to inspect that traffic that is coming in through OA actually matches the expected behavior or traffic patterns that are typical to OA or MAPI and so forth and so on. Now, once you go down that route, which means that you're going really deep into the security stack of the HTTPS connections, beware that it may break functionality, more notably Exchange Web Services in the MRS proxy. They don't really like you snooping around within that traffic. So don't go overboard and just enable it across the board. But typically, it is something that you can easily do for OWA and for auto discover and stuff like that. And lastly, was upon request, I thought someone on Twitter said, "Hey, Michael, can you talk a little bit about hybrid publishing?" Sure. So hybrid is a different beast, right? Because as you can see, there's lots of errors going back and forth. And why is it a different beast? The principles that you saw here, right, the on-prem secure publishing, remain. However, we are now forced to allow connections from outside the internet directly into the Exchange server as well. If we talk about hybrid mail flow, you can't put a mail filtering solution in between the Exchange servers and Exchange Online. In theory, you could, but that's a different story. But we don't want that, right? So you have to make sure that the traffic from Exchange Online, SMTP, hybrid mail traffic, that is, flows in through the firewall and goes directly to the backend SMTP services, so that you make sure that all the headers that need to be there are still there. That's fairly simple. Now, inbound auto discover needs to be available. So you do it through the firewall, through reverse proxy to the Exchange server, pretty similar to how you would do it before. And the same goes for EWS, more specifically the Exchange Web Services MRS proxy for mailbox moves that you send them in through the firewall through a reverse proxy. Don't do SSL offloading, not supported, and then just make sure that it re-encrypts back to the Exchange servers. This is fairly simple, right? I mean, this is similar setup to before, but we just add the Exchange Online bits and pieces there, and make sure that it can securely connect to the backend servers. The problem, or not a problem, the challenge we have here is that oftentimes very secure environments will challenge this model because it says, well, we need inbound connections from Exchange Online, which is a variety of IP addresses, into the Exchange servers. Now, if you trust to move to Exchange Online, then I think you can trust Microsoft's IP addresses. At least that's my opinion. But there are organizations that don't want this because they don't want to expose these endpoints publicly. They don't want to make it available publicly. Whatever the reason is, there's different ways that you can go about. And one of them is the modern agent or the modern way of doing hybrid, whereby we're actually cutting off some of the inbound connectivity. And as you can see, auto discover is the only one that still needs to be there inbound. And even then, we could cut off auto discover and not expose it publicly. And we're just replacing the inbound connectivity with that hybrid modern agent, which sits in your data center, talks to the Exchange server, so it makes HTTPS connections to Exchange. That in itself can either directly or through a proxy server connect to Exchange Online, and then the mailbox moves piggyback on that outbound connection. And so what you can see here is how adding that one component or multiple hybrid agents, because they can load balance or fail over for one another, prevent or limit the amount of exposure you have on the external side of things on that firewall. Now, you still need SMTP to flow directly in and out because it doesn't use the same method as the hybrid modern agent offers for HTTPS. So that will remain. So that hybrid endpoint for hybrid mail flow, whether you run it through an edge transport server or directly to the backend servers, that's a different story. I mean, that's basically the same. That will remain. So as you can compare both, what we're taking away basically is the inbound connection EWS, potentially the inbound connection over auto discover. But if you have external clients on the internet that need to connect, then you need auto discover anyway, unless you're banking on just using auto discover v2. But there's other challenges there. So ultimately, this is what it would look like where you still have an auto discover going to Exchange, but replace the inbound connections for mailbox moves with that outbound connection. So I mean, this is a lot of things to digest in 50 minutes, and I know that I'm probably going to go like 2-3 minutes over time. So basically, looking at exchange, right? It's much more than exchange. There's this little piece, this little layer that is called exchange, where you need to make sure that your configuration is done correctly, that you patch regularly. But there's a whole plethora of other things, and in my opinion, exchange isn't the problem. It's the operating systems, it's the insecure ADs, it's the architecture around that I see much more often being sinned against, right? Where they don't have proper security baseline, they haven't been hardened, the network isn't great, there aren't, the publishing isn't done great, certificates aren't being taken care of correctly. All of these things, lower the security and increase the attack surface of exchange, which then becomes an easy target, I would say, and a very interesting target for attackers to exploit and gain further access within the environment. Now, that being said, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. So I'll stop sharing the screen now and see if anyone has any questions.
Michael, we are at time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but you're welcome to continue answering the questions as part of the live event, okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Right, you bet.